I was halfway down the hall of my own hotel when I froze at the sound of my sister's voice echoing from the bridal suite. At first I thought she was just chatting nervously with her planner about flowers or music. But then I heard the words that made my blood run cold. "Cancel her invitation," Lauren said crisply, her tone sharp like she was snapping her fingers at a servant. "And keep the $50,000 deposit she paid." My stomach twisted. She was talking about me, about the money I had given, thinking it was a gift of love, a bridge between us. I pressed myself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. The planner's voice was low, hesitant. "Are you sure, Miss Cole? She is your sister." Lauren laughed softly. "Sister or not, she'll get over it. She's loaded anyway. And besides, this is my day, not hers." I felt my chest tighten, my pulse beating in my ears. For a second I wanted to storm and demand answers, but I forced myself to step back into the shadows. My sister's betrayal wasn't a misunderstanding, it was deliberate. And if she thought I would simply let her walk over me again, she was about to learn who really held the power. When I was a child, Lauren used to cling to my hand at night during thunderstorms, whispering that she would never let me go. I believed her then. But people change. Or maybe they just reveal who they truly are when they think no one is watching. Standing in that hallway, listening to her scheme to erase me from her wedding, I realized that the girl I once protected had grown into a woman who saw me as nothing more than a wallet. My name is Marissa Cole. I am 32 years old, and I own Cole Grand Hotels, a boutique chain along the South Carolina coast, and Low Country Elite Catering, one of the most sought-after services in Charleston. My empire wasn't handed to me. Every chandelier, every linen, every polished marble floor was the result of my sweat and sacrifice. People see me now and assume privilege, but my reality was forged in struggle. Lauren and I grew up in the shadow of our parents' broken marriage. When I was 16, the shouting finally ended with divorce papers. Our father moved into a small apartment with his new girlfriend. Our mother stayed in the family house, dragging Lauren with her, insisting that she needed her more than I did. I was left to navigate my own path, balancing high school with late-night shifts at a cafe, just to keep the lights on. I remember standing in line at the grocery store, counting change to buy milk while Lauren tugged on my sleeve, begging for cookies. I gave in, using the last of my tips to keep her smiling. Back then it felt like my responsibility. I was the strong one. Mom always said it. "Marissa, you're tough. Lauren needs protecting. Don't let her struggle." So I protected, I paid, I gave. And slowly I learned that love in our family was conditional, measured by how much I could provide. College wasn't easy. I earned a scholarship to the University of South Carolina, majoring in hospitality management. To survive, I juggled classes, part-time jobs, and late-night study sessions. Lauren, meanwhile, lived comfortably with Mom, shielded from the real world. I didn't resent her, not then. I told myself that was my role, the big sister who carried the weight. After graduation, I landed a job at a luxury resort. My manager, impressed by my dedication, promoted me within a year. By the time I turned 25, I was managing entire departments, often working 16-hour days. The turning point came when I discovered a crumbling historic hotel on the edge of Charleston's waterfront. Its peeling paint and cracked floors scared off most investors, but I saw potential. With my savings and a loan that terrified me, I bought it. The renovation nearly broke me. I worked alongside contractors, painting walls, cleaning molds, scrubbing bathrooms myself. Lauren never came to help, but she was quick to brag to her friends. "My sister owns a hotel." When the Cole Grand finally reopened, the reviews were glowing. Couples booked weddings, conferences filled the ballroom, and slowly the balance sheets tipped into profit. Within a few years, I expanded into 2 more properties, then 3, each one carrying the Cole name. Lauren, meanwhile, drifted through life in Charleston's social scene. She always had new boyfriends, new outfits, new excuses. Whenever she fell short, an unpaid bill, a broken-down car, a semester she wanted to take off, I was the one she called. And I always answered. Because deep down, I clung to the memory of the little sister clutching my hand during storms, promising never to let me go. That promise was shattered the moment I overheard her plotting with her wedding planner. She wasn't a frightened child anymore. She was a woman ready to erase me from her life while pocketing my generosity. I pressed my palms against the cool wall of the hallway, fighting the sting in my eyes. The deposit, $50,000, wasn't pocket change. It represented months of careful budgeting profits I could have reinvested into my business. I had given it gladly, thinking it was a chance to prove that despite the favoritism, despite the neglect, I was still family. And now my own sister was turning that gift into a weapon. I didn't storm into the suite. Not yet. Instead, I turned away, forcing myself to walk calmly back toward my office. Each step echoed like a drumbeat, steadying me. If they thought they could exclude me from my own blood's wedding, they had forgotten who signed the contracts, who owned the ballroom, who controlled every plate of food, every guest room, every light that would shine on their big day. In my office, I sat behind my desk and stared at the framed contract on the wall, the one every client signs when booking Cole Grand. Section 12 stood out like a beacon, the right of the venue to cancel any event that violated the company's ethical standards or posed a risk to its reputation. At the time I drafted it, I had been thinking of unruly guests or fraudulent events. I never imagined I might use it against my own sister. But betrayal has a way of opening your eyes. Lauren saw me as the help. Margaret Whitmore, her soon-to-be mother-in-law, treated me like a service provider, not family. And now they thought they could steal from me and erase me in the same breath. I leaned back in my chair, inhaling deeply. The city skyline shimmered beyond my window, the same city that had once dismissed me as new money, the hotel girl. They hadn't believed I would make it then. They were wrong. And Lauren was about to discover that underestimating me had consequences. For the first time in years, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not the calm of surrender, but the calm of resolve. Revenge wasn't about shouting in hallways or begging for inclusion. It was about power, about drawing a line so clear that no one could cross it without paying the price. And my sister was about to learn just how high that price could be. The morning after I overheard Lauren's call, I sat in my office at Cole Grand, staring at the ledger that had once been my pride. Rows of numbers blurred into each other, but all I could see was the $50,000 I had wired for her wedding. It wasn't just money. It was years of sacrifice, years of proving to myself that I could build something from nothing. And yet, in her voice last night, I heard nothing but contempt, as if my contribution were a nuisance, an obligation she could twist to her advantage. I leaned back and closed my eyes, letting the memories flood in. 16 years old, walking home after a late shift at the cafe, my apron smelling of grease and coffee. My backpack weighed down with textbooks, my shoes worn thin. I used to count the coins in my pocket, deciding whether to buy bus fare or bread for the morning. At home, Lauren would be curled up on the couch, flipping through glossy magazines, mom beside her with a soft smile. "Marissa, you're strong," mom would say, not looking up. "Your sister needs me more, you'll figure it out." And I did. I always did. By 18, I'd already built a shell around my heart. Scholarships became my lifeline, and when I got into the University of South Carolina for hospitality management, I swore I'd never go back to being the girl who counted coins on the kitchen table. I worked double shifts at a hotel downtown, sneaking in homework between check-ins, scrubbing bathrooms after midnight. Professors noticed my tenacity. Supervisors noticed my dedication. Slowly, I built a reputation for being reliable, competent, unbreakable. Lauren didn't have to fight like that. She stayed with mom, cushioned by excuses and indulgence. When she didn't feel like working, mom covered her bills. When she dropped out of community college for the second time, it was framed as finding herself. And when her car broke down, guess who wrote the check? Me. I told myself it was love. That was what sisters did. The first hotel I bought was nothing more than a crumbling relic on the edge of Charleston's historic district. The wallpaper peeled, pipes leaked, and the once grand lobby reeked of mildew. Friends told me I was crazy, but I saw what it could be: a beacon of elegance. For months I scrubbed floors, painted walls, and bargained with contractors for lower rates. I ate ramen in the staff kitchen, sometimes falling asleep at a desk surrounded by invoices. Slowly the pieces came together. When the doors reopened, guests poured in, enchanted by the mix of old-world charm and modern luxury. That was the birth of Cole Grand Hotels. Within 5 years I added 2 more properties. Then came Lowcountry Elite Catering, a natural extension of my vision. Flawless events, unforgettable meals, everything tailored to perfection. My calendar filled with society weddings, galas, and political fundraisers. Charleston's elite toasted their champagne beneath the chandeliers I had polished with my own hands. They didn't care about the girl who once worked night shifts, they only cared about the empire she had built. And yet to my own family I was never more than a resource. The successful one, the strong one, the one who didn't need help. Lauren, of course, gravitated toward Ethan Whitmore, the golden boy of Charleston. He came from a family of construction magnates, the Whitmore name etched on half the buildings downtown. Ethan was handsome in a polished, forgettable way, perfectly parted hair, an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His parents, Charles and Margaret, had built a fortress of reputation and wealth around themselves. Old money, sharp eyes, and sharper tongues. The first time I met them was at a dinner Lauren insisted we attend. I remember Margaret's eyes sweeping over me like I was part of the waitstaff. She smiled, thin and deliberate. "So you're the sister," she said. "You run hotels, I believe." Her voice lingered on the word like it was something unsavory. "Yes," I replied evenly. "Cole Grand Hotels. We host diplomats, governors, and some of your husband's business associates." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. "Ah, service work. It must be exhausting: complaints, linens, endless demands. I suppose some people are suited to that." Lauren laughed too loudly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Ethan sat quietly sipping his wine, avoiding my gaze. That night as I drove home, I realized Margaret didn't see me as family. She saw me as a vendor. And Lauren didn't see me as a sister, she saw me as leverage, a way to impress the Whitmores with her successful sibling. Mom only made it worse. She clung to the idea that Lauren was fragile, that every indulgence was justified. "Marissa, don't be so hard on her," she scolded when I complained. "You have everything now. Let her enjoy her time." Enjoy. That was Lauren's specialty. While I juggled budgets and staff crises, she floated through boutiques and brunches, collecting compliments like pearls. When Ethan proposed, it was as if she had won the crown. Margaret beamed, Charles nodded approvingly, and Mom cried tears of joy. I gave them $50,000 without hesitation, telling myself this was the moment to prove I was part of the family. But last night, standing in that hallway, I understood the truth. They never intended to see me as family at all. I pushed the ledger aside and stared out the window of my office. The city skyline shimmered in the distance, a reminder of everything I had built. Below, staff bustled through the lobby, polishing floors, arranging flowers, preparing for another day of guests. They respected me. They looked at me and saw a leader. Yet in my own family, I was invisible, useful, but disposable. I thought about the dinner at the Whitmore's house a few weeks earlier. Margaret had leaned in across the table, her pearls glinting under the chandelier. "A wedding isn't just a celebration," she said. "It's a statement of one's place in society." Lauren nodded eagerly. "Exactly. Some people don't understand true elegance. They think money is enough." She looked at me when she said it, her smile sugar-sweet. Charles had cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably, but he hadn't contradicted her. And Ethan, poor Ethan, just stared at his plate, trapped between the women in his life. I had bitten my tongue, swallowing the urge to lash out. But now, with the contract framed on my wall, I knew I no longer had to swallow anything. Family had used me as a crutch, as a bank, as a convenient prop to display when it suited them. They thought I was too soft, too forgiving, too desperate for their approval to ever fight back. They were wrong. I traced a finger over the signature on the contract, my name bold and final. Section 12 gave me all the leverage I needed. And this time I wasn't going to hand it away. Lauren could erase me from her wedding. Margaret could sneer at my work. Mom could pretend that favoritism wasn't poisoning us from the inside out. But none of them could erase what I had built, or the power I now held. I leaned back, a calm smile tugging at my lips. If they thought betrayal would silence me, they had underestimated the woman I had become. And for the first time, I found myself almost looking forward to the storm that was about to come. 2 weeks before the wedding, I walked into the grand ballroom of my flagship hotel and nearly collided with a swarm of florists carrying buckets of imported orchids. Lauren stood in the center of the chaos, clipboard in hand, barking orders like a general. Margaret hovered beside her lips, pursed eyes scanning every detail, as if the fate of the Whitmore family name rested on the placement of each flower. I hadn't been invited to this walkthrough. My staff had. When Anthony, my events manager, texted me a frantic message, "They're demanding changes that'll cost triple the budget. Please help." I left my office upstairs and came down. The ballroom was a vision of elegance, the chandeliers gleaming the floor, polished to a mirror shine. But Margaret's frown told me none of it was enough. "These chairs," she said, tapping one with a manicured finger, "they're upholstered in beige. Lauren's vision is ivory. Beige looks cheap." Anthony cleared his throat nervously. "We can provide chair covers to match your palette. That's standard for weddings." Lauren rolled her eyes dramatically. "Covers look tacky. We want them reupholstered. All 300. Reupholstered? I stepped forward, unable to hold back. "That would require removing and refitting every chair, not to mention the cost." Margaret cut me off with a chilly smile. "Cost is irrelevant when striving for perfection." I met her gaze steadily. "Not when the contract specifies decorative enhancements, not permanent alterations. Chair covers are the reasonable solution." Lauren's eyes narrowed. "God, Marissa, you're always so negative. This is my wedding, not one of your conferences." The words hit me harder than they should have. My wedding. As if everything I had contributed, the venue, the catering, the $50,000 deposit, meant nothing. Anthony looked from me to them, caught in the crossfire. I placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Provide them with a variety of chair cover samples by tomorrow," I instructed. "Elegant ones. Lace, satin, whatever they want. We'll make it beautiful without gutting the ballroom." Margaret's lips thinned, but she said nothing. Lauren huffed, muttering something about compromises under her breath. The meeting dragged on for hours. They demanded a 10-tier cake, each layer in a different imported flavor. They wanted a champagne fountain so tall it would need custom scaffolding. They insisted the historic chandelier in the center of the ballroom be removed because it clashed with the modern fairy tale theme. "That chandelier is original to the building," I said firmly. "It's part of our history. We can add lighting installations around it, but it stays." Margaret sniffed. "History is overrated. Guests care about atmosphere." I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "Guests also care about safety. That chandelier weighs half a ton. Removing it risks damage to the ceiling and the ballroom floor." "It isn't happening." Lauren crossed her arms, glaring. "Why do you always make everything so difficult?" "Because I'm the one who has to keep this place standing when you're done throwing your tantrum," I snapped before I could stop myself. Silence fell, broken only by the rustle of flowers as the florists exchanged awkward glances. For a moment I thought Lauren might scream. But Margaret laid a hand on her daughter's arm, her eyes cold and calculating. "Let it go," she murmured. "We'll find another way." When they finally swept out of the ballroom, Anthony exhaled heavily. "You're a saint," he said, running a hand through his hair. "If I had to deal with them one more hour, I'd quit." "You're not quitting," I told him, though I felt the same exhaustion in my bones. "We'll get through this." As the staff cleared away the chaos, I lingered in the empty ballroom. The chandelier sparkled above me, a reminder of everything I had fought to preserve. Lauren wanted fairy tale perfection, but I was the one making it possible. And still, she treated me like an obstacle. That night, I called Mom hoping for some comfort. "She's under a lot of stress," Mom said quickly after I vented about the day. "Weddings bring out the worst in people. Don't take it personally. Don't take it personally." My voice cracked. "She's trying to erase me from my own hotel, from my life. And you want me to excuse it." "She's your sister," Mom said gently. "She's always been fragile. You're stronger. Can't you just let her have this moment?" I stared at the phone in disbelief. Fragile. Always that word. Always the excuse. I ended the call before I said something I couldn't take back. The next morning, I walked into my office to find an email from Victoria Hayes, the wedding planner. The subject line read, "Updated requests." I opened the attachment and nearly laughed at the absurdity: 15 new menu samples, half of which required ingredients flown in from Europe. A demand for a floral arch twice the size of the one we'd already built. A request for a custom ice sculpture shaped like the Whitmore crest. I scrolled to the bottom and saw the note, per instruction of the bride and Mrs. Whitmore, "Please ensure these are prioritized. Miss Cole does not need to be included on further correspondence." Miss Cole, not Marissa. Not the woman funding half this circus. Just another vendor. I sat back in my chair, my jaw tightening. This wasn't stress. This wasn't about being fragile. This was deliberate. They were cutting me out piece by piece. Later that week, I stopped by the ballroom again, unannounced. Lauren was there with Margaret and Victoria reviewing the seating chart projected on a screen. My eyes darted across the names and froze. My name wasn't there, not even at a side table. I cleared my throat. "Where's my seat?" Lauren's eyes widened, then narrowed. "Oh, about that," Margaret stepped in smoothly. "The guest list is very tight, dear. We had to make difficult choices." I laughed, bitter and sharp. Difficult choices, excluding the groom's only sister, the woman who paid $50,000 toward this wedding. That was your choice. Lauren shifted uncomfortably, but Margaret held my gaze. A wedding is about creating the right atmosphere. Sometimes sacrifices must be made. Sacrifices. That word echoed in my head long after I stormed out of the ballroom. Sacrifices like the childhood I gave up to raise Lauren. Sacrifices like the money I handed over to prove I was family. Sacrifices like my dignity every time I swallowed their insults. I walked back to my office, my heels clicking against the marble floor. With each step, the anger hardened into something colder, sharper. They thought they could erase me, but they had forgotten whose name was etched on the contract. Whose hotel this was, whose catering company they depended on. I wasn't just family. I was the foundation of this entire wedding. And if they wanted to play games, they were about to learn how high the stakes really were. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be a celebration, but from the moment I walked into the Whitmore's country club dining hall, I felt the weight of every eye on me. Crystal chandeliers glittered above linen-covered tables, the air heavy with the scent of roses and expensive perfume. Waiters glided between guests carrying trays of champagne. At the head table, Lauren sat with Margaret, and Charles, her smile painted on like a mask. Ethan beside her looked stiff, his jaw tight, but he didn't say a word. Mom waved me over from a side table, her face caught between nervous pride and guilt. Dad, sitting across from her, gave me a curt nod. It had been years since the divorce, yet they still couldn't be in the same room without bristling. Tonight, though, their tension paled in comparison to what pulsed beneath the surface, the deliberate exclusion that no one wanted to name out loud. As I sat down, Margaret's gaze flickered over me like I was a latecomer who hadn't RSVP'd. "Ah, Marissa," she said, her smile tight. "So glad you could join us. We weren't sure if your schedule would allow it." "My schedule," I repeated, forcing calm into my voice. "Considering I own the venue hosting your daughter's wedding, I thought I was expected." A ripple of awkward silence passed through the table. Lauren's cheeks flushed, but she quickly recovered. "Mother just meant you're always busy with your hotels. We didn't want to assume." I let the words hang between us. Assume. That was the story of my life. Assumed strong enough, assumed unbothered, assumed disposable. The conversation shifted to wedding details. Margaret gushed about the imported orchids, the custom invitations printed in gold foil, the string quartet flown in from New York. Lauren added her commentary, her tone airy. But whenever I asked a question, the table went quiet. "Who's giving the toasts?" I asked at one point. Ethan opened his mouth, but Margaret's hand on his arm stopped him. "We've handled the program," she said briskly. "Don't worry yourself. Don't worry yourself." As if I were meddling. As if the sister who funded and hosted the entire affair had no right to ask. Halfway through the entree, Eleanor raised her glass, her voice cutting across the chatter. "A wedding," she declared, "isn't merely a celebration of love. It's a statement. It tells the world where you belong, what circles you move in." Her eyes found mine glinting like steel. "It's about knowing the difference between serving the elite and being one of them." Lauren nodded eagerly, lifting her own glass. "Exactly. Some people don't understand the pressure of making everything perfect. But I do." My fork froze midair. I looked at Ethan, hoping for some spark of resistance, but his gaze was locked on his plate. Dad cleared his throat, fumbling for defense. "Marissa's hotels are top-rated. She knows elegance just fine." Margaret smiled at him, the way a cat smiles at a mouse. "Yes, but there's a distinction, isn't there, between offering elegance to others and embodying it yourself?" The table buzzed with murmured approval. My mother, perhaps realizing how cornered I felt, jumped in. "Marissa has been so generous. Without her, none of this would be possible." Lauren's reply was swift, sharp. "Yes, the contribution was helpful. But we had to make so many upgrades to bring things up to standard." Helpful. Up to standard. My chest burned. $50,000 wasn't pocket change. It was months of profit, weeks of my life poured into someone else's dream. Yet here it was dismissed like an afterthought, a favor begrudgingly accepted. I set my fork down, hands trembling beneath the tablecloth. The Cole Grand is already 5-star. Diplomats, governors, celebrities stay there without complaint. If it's not up to your standard, perhaps the problem isn't the venue. Margaret tilted her head, feigning sympathy. "We appreciate your effort, dear. Truly. But some visions require more than service." The word hung in the air like poison. Service. That was all I was to them. Not family, not sister, just staff. The rest of dinner blurred. Toasts were made, laughter rang out, but none of it reached me. I sat stiffly, smiling when expected, swallowing my fury with every sip of wine. Lauren laughed too loudly at Ethan's father's jokes. Ethan himself seemed miles away, his smile brittle, and all the while Margaret's gaze flicked toward me, satisfied, triumphant. After dessert, I caught James, no Ethan, outside on the terrace. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of jasmine from the gardens. He leaned on the railing, staring at the manicured lawn. For a moment he looked younger, almost lost. "You okay?" I asked softly. He jumped, then forced a smile. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." I hesitated. "Doesn't it bother you? The way they talk about me?" His smile faltered. "You know how my family is. They care about appearances." "It's not personal." "Not personal," my voice shook. "They want to erase me from your wedding. Your only sister. How is that not personal?" He rubbed his temples. "Marissa, please. I'm under so much pressure. This wedding, it's not just about us. It's about business connections, our future. Our future. Not his, not Lauren's, theirs. A future built on sacrificing me." I swallowed hard. "Since when do connections matter more than family?" "People grow up," he said quietly. "They change. Maybe you should try it sometime." The words hit like a slap. I stepped back, my hands curling into fists. "If you can't stand up for me now, when will you? After they've erased me completely? After you've let them decide who counts as family and who doesn't?" He didn't answer. He just stared out into the night, shoulders slumped, as if the weight of expectation had already crushed him. I turned and walked away, my heels clicking against the stone patio, each step heavier than the last. Back in my car, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. They thought they could reduce me to nothing more than a vendor, a bank account, a shadow in the background. But I wasn't a woman who broke easily. As the headlights cut through the Charleston night, a single thought crystallized in my mind. If they wanted to treat me like staff, then I would remind them who really owned the building they were so desperate to flaunt. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. But soon they would see just how wrong they were. 3 days after the rehearsal dinner, my phone rang in the middle of a budget meeting. The number was unfamiliar, but something in my gut told me to answer. I excused myself, stepping into the hallway with the Charleston skyline glittering beyond the tall windows. "Hello, this is Marissa Cole." A pause, then a crisp, professional voice, "Miss Cole. This is Victoria Hayes, the wedding planner for the Cole-Whitmore ceremony scheduled next week at the Cole Grand." My heart sank. "Yes, Victoria." "Is there an issue with the arrangements?" "Not with the arrangements," she hesitated. "I was instructed to call regarding your attendance." "My attendance?" Her voice stiffened as though she was reading from a script. "I regret to inform you that your invitation to the wedding has been rescinded. However, the family intends to proceed with all contracted services and retain the $50,000 deposit you contributed." The words slammed into me like a blow. I gripped the wall to steady myself. "Excuse me." The bride, Miss Cole, and her mother provided these instructions. They assured me that Mr. Whitmore was aware and in agreement. My own sister, my blood, and Ethan, the boy I once thought of as family. Together they had decided I was unworthy of even witnessing their vows, but worthy enough to bankroll them. I forced my voice to remain steady. "And may I ask the reason?" Victoria cleared her throat. "I was told your presence might distract from the intended atmosphere. Concerns were also raised about confusion regarding your role, since you own the venue and catering. There was worry you might be perceived as staff rather than family." Staff. The word cut deeper than any insult. After everything I had built, after years of carrying Lauren on my back, she wanted me erased because I reminded her of where she came from. I closed my eyes, anger burning through the humiliation. "Victoria, let me be clear. I own the Cole Grand. I own Low Country Elite Catering. I own the hotel where out-of-town guests will be staying. Without me, there is no wedding." Silence stretched on the line, broken only by Victoria's uneasy breath. "I wasn't aware." "I'll make this simple," I said, my voice calm, lethal. "You will inform Lauren and Margaret that unless I receive a formal apology and a reinstated invitation by 5 o'clock today, the entire wedding is cancelled. All deposits forfeited per Section 12 of the contract." "Do you understand?" Her sharp intake of breath told me she did. "Yes, Miss Cole. I'll relay the message." I ended the call and stood there in the quiet hallway, my pulse pounding. For years, I had been the dependable one, the forgiving one, the sister who absorbed every slight for the sake of peace. But peace had bought me nothing but betrayal. This time I wasn't asking. This time I was drawing a line. Within minutes, my phone buzzed with call after call. Ethan, Lauren, even Margaret. I ignored them all. For once, they would have to sit with their panic. By 4:30, my office phone was ringing, non-stop emails flooding my inbox. Staff whispered in the hallway, sensing the storm brewing. Anthony poked his head into my office, his brow furrowed. "What's going on?" "The Whitmores have been in the lobby for 20 minutes demanding to see you." I stood, smoothing my blazer. "Good, let them wait. Then escort them to the conference room, not my office. This is business now." When I entered the conference room, the air was thick with tension. Lauren sat rigid, her face pale, mascara smudged beneath her eyes. Margaret was livid, lips pressed, thin pearls gleaming against her throat like armor. Charles looked uneasy, shifting in his chair. My parents were there too, confusion etched on their faces. And Ethan looked like a stranger caught between shame and anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Lauren snapped the moment I closed the door. I didn't sit. I stood tall at the head of the table, enforcing the terms of my contract and standing up for myself. Margaret leaned forward, voice dripping venom. "This is outrageous. We have a binding agreement. You cannot cancel a wedding 10 days before the event." "Actually, I can." I pointed to the contract in my hand. Section 12 grants me the right to cancel any event that violates our ethical standards or risks our reputation. Excluding the venue owner while keeping her financial contribution qualifies as both. "That money was a gift," Lauren said quickly, her voice trembling. "Gifts don't usually come with invoices and contracts," I countered. "And they certainly don't entitle you to erase your only sister." My mother finally found her voice. "Lauren, is this true? Did you tell the planner Marissa wasn't invited?" Lauren's eyes darted to Margaret, who remained stone-faced. "It was a misunderstanding." Victoria, seated quietly in the corner, spoke up. "I followed your instructions exactly. You told me to rescind Miss Cole's invitation but keep the deposit." The room fell silent. Margaret recovered first. "So there was a miscommunication. Hardly grounds to ruin an entire wedding." "This was no miscommunication," I said, my voice sharp. "It was calculated. You wanted my money, my venue, my catering, but not me. And that ends today." Ethan finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Nat, you don't understand the pressure." "Don't call me Nat," I snapped. "You forfeited that right when you agreed to erase me." He flinched, his mouth snapping shut. I turned to the group. "Here are my terms. I receive a formal apology from Lauren and Ethan, and my place as family is respected at this wedding. Otherwise, the event is cancelled. All deposits forfeited. And good luck finding another venue in Charleston with 10 days' notice." Margaret slammed her hand on the table. "This is extortion. This is a boundary I corrected. One you should have expected the moment you underestimated me." For the first time, Charles spoke, his voice measured. "Perhaps we should compromise. Miss Cole, what would it take to let the wedding proceed?" I met his eyes. "Respect. That's all. Acknowledgement that what you tried to do was wrong, and assurance it won't happen again." Lauren's voice broke. "You're ruining everything." "No, Lauren," I said softly, though steel threaded my words. "You did that yourself." The room fell into uneasy silence. My parents stared at us, finally forced to confront the favoritism they'd ignored for years. Ethan sat with his head in his hands. Margaret glared daggers, but even she knew the truth. Without me, there was no wedding. I stood, sliding the contract back into my folder. "The choice is yours. Apologize and move forward, or walk away with nothing. Either way, I won't be erased." With that, I left the conference room, the click of my heels echoing down the marble hall. For the first time in years, I felt lighter, stronger. They had pushed me too far. Now they would finally see the cost of betrayal. The storm broke the next morning. My phone buzzed relentlessly, texts, voicemails, emails, all screaming with the same message: "Fix this." By noon, even the hotel receptionists were fielding calls from panicked vendors. The florist wanted to know if the order was still valid. The band needed confirmation before loading their equipment into a van. And the dressmaker, flown in from Milan, left a voicemail dripping with rage. "If this wedding is cancelled, someone will reimburse me for my time." I sat in my office sipping black coffee, as if the world wasn't unraveling around me. Anthony poked his head and his eyes wide. "They're back," he whispered. "All of them. Lauren, Margaret, Ethan. Your parents, even the Whitmore's attorney. They're demanding an emergency meeting." I set down my cup and stood adjusting the lapels of my blazer. "Conference room again. And bring in a notary this time. If they want to play business, we'll play by the rules." When I entered, the tension was suffocating. Lauren's face was blotchy from crying, mascara streaked beneath her eyes. Margaret's fury radiated like heat, her pearls practically rattling against her collarbone. Charles looked grave, his attorney seated beside him with a thick binder of contracts. Ethan slumped in his chair, avoiding my gaze. My parents lingered near the door, looking smaller than I'd ever seen them. Marissa Margaret began, her voice low and dangerous. This tantrum of yours has gone far enough. Do you have any idea the chaos you've caused? Chaos? I repeated, my voice calm. I didn't tell the planner to erase my name from the guest list. I didn't take $50,000 and then try to treat my sister like staff. I'm merely responding to the choices you made. Lauren's voice cracked. You're supposed to be my sister. You were supposed to help me. I did help you, I said, my words sharp as glass. I gave you my venue, my catering, my money. And in return you tried to humiliate me. That's not help, Lauren. That's exploitation. The attorney cleared his throat. Miss Cole, while your frustration is understandable, the Whitmores are prepared to pursue legal action if you cancel this event. There are contracts, subcontracts, reputations at stake. I slid a copy of the contract across the table, flipping it open to Section 12. Right here, clear as day. The Cole Grand reserves the right to cancel any event that violates its ethical standards, excluding the owner while keeping her financial contribution qualifies. If you'd like to challenge it in court, be my guest. But you won't win, and you'll drag your family name through headlines for months. Charles shifted uncomfortably. The attorney frowned, scanning the clause, then whispered something in his ear. Margaret's glare could have cut steel. This is extortion, she spat. This, I said evenly, is me setting a boundary. Something this family should have done a long time ago. Ethan finally lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot. Marissa, please. Don't do this. Don't destroy the wedding. I turned to him, my chest tightening despite everything. I'm not destroying it. I'm giving you a choice. Do you want a wedding that excludes your only sister, funded by her money held in her hotel? Or do you want a wedding built on honesty and respect? His lips parted, but no words came out. Lauren seized the silence. She's manipulating you, Ethan. She's jealous. She's always been jealous of me. I laughed, a sound as bitter as it was true. Jealous, Lauren. I built my empire from the ground up. I scrubbed floors, worked double shifts, signed loans that nearly broke me. Everything I have, I earned. You've spent your life being coddled, and you still resent me. You're not worth my jealousy. Her face went crimson, her fists clenching in her lap. Margaret leaned forward, her voice icy. What do you want, Marissa? Name it. Money, recognition. What's the price of your forgiveness? I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. I don't want your money. I want respect. A written apology from Lauren and Ethan. A public acknowledgement in the program that my contribution made this wedding possible. And above all, I want to be treated as family, not staff. The room went silent. My parents exchanged looks, shame flickering across their faces. For once, Dad didn't defend Lauren. Mom's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Finally, Charles spoke. Given the circumstances, those terms seem reasonable. Margaret's head snapped toward him. Reasonable? She's holding us hostage. No, he said firmly. She's protecting herself. Something we should have taught our own children. Lauren broke into sobs, burying her face in her hands. You're ruining everything. This was supposed to be perfect. I felt a pang, but I didn't soften. Perfect doesn't mean erasing people. It doesn't mean trampling over the ones who carried you here. You wanted a fairy tale, Lauren, but fairy tales built on lies collapse. The notary cleared her throat, pulling papers from her bag. Shall I prepare the written acknowledgement? Then Margaret's fury was palpable, but Charles placed a hand on her arm. Yes, prepare it. As the documents were drafted, Ethan's gaze finally met mine. There was regret there, and something else, recognition. I'm sorry, he whispered, too quiet for the others to hear. I gave a small nod. Words were easy. Change was harder. By the time the meeting adjourned, the Whitmores had signed the agreement, the apology letter drafted and notarized. Margaret stormed out without a word. Lauren followed, her sobs echoing down the hall. Ethan lingered, but when his mother called his name sharply, he hurried after her. My parents stayed behind. Mom touched my arm, her eyes glistening. Marissa, I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. You didn't want to realize, I corrected gently. But now you can't ignore it. Dad shifted awkwardly, then said the words, "I never thought I'd hear. You deserved better from us." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The anger, the hurt, the years of being overlooked pressed down on me. But hearing that finally, after so long, lifted a weight I didn't know I still carried. When I returned to my office, Anthony was waiting. "How'd it go?" I smiled faintly. "They signed. The wedding goes on." He raised his brows. "And you?" I looked out at the city skyline, the sun dipping low, painting the water gold. For the first time, I think I'm finally free, but deep down I knew the real battle wasn't over. Lauren's fury wouldn't fade quietly. Margaret's pride wouldn't forgive humiliation. And Ethan stood at a crossroads only he could choose. One way or another, the wedding day was going to change everything. The rehearsal dinner 2 nights before the wedding felt more like a battlefield than a celebration. I arrived at the private dining room of the Peninsula Club, dressed in a navy silk dress, simple but sharp, a deliberate choice. I wanted no one mistaking me for staff this time. Conversations dipped when I walked in, the clinking of glasses faltering as eyes turned to me. I held my head high, refusing to let their stares shrink me. James, no, Ethan, spotted me first. He rose quickly, crossing the room with a smile that seemed almost too eager. "Marissa," he said warmly, kissing my cheek. "I'm glad you're here." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied evenly, letting my voice carry enough weight to remind everyone that my presence was not optional. At the head table, Lauren sat rigid. Her smile stretched so tightly it looked painful. Beside her, Margaret sipped champagne, her eyes sliding past me as though I were invisible. Charles gave me a respectful nod, surprising me, and even pulled out a chair near the head of the table. The gesture earned him a daggered glare from his wife. Throughout, dinner conversations swirled around me like smoke. Guests praised the imported wine, the Parisian florist, the string quartet rehearsing for the ceremony. Whenever I joined in, Lauren's smile froze, her knuckles whitening around her glass. Halfway through, Margaret finally leaned toward me, her voice smooth but cutting. "We do appreciate your contribution, Marissa. It's admirable that you've managed to build something from scratch. Something. As if Cole Grand and 3 hotels were lemonade stands." I smiled sweetly. "Yes, admirable. Especially considering some of us start with nothing while others have everything handed to them." A silence fell. Lauren's face flushed scarlet. Ethan cleared his throat and raised his glass, desperate to redirect. "To family," he said quickly. "To a weekend we'll never forget." Everyone echoed the toast, but the weight of my words lingered. Later, as plates were cleared and coffee was poured, Charles surprised me again. He approached with a handshake firm and deliberate. "Miss Cole," he said, lowering his voice so Margaret couldn't overhear, "I owe you an apology. You handled yourself with more dignity this week than most people in my world ever manage. For what it's worth, I respect that." I studied him, searching for a trap, but his expression was sincere, almost weary. "Thank you," I said quietly. "Respect means more than you think." "Charles," he corrected gently. "We're almost family after all. Almost." The word stung, but I let it pass. After dessert, I stepped out onto the terrace to escape the tension. The night was warm, the harbor lights shimmering across the water. I leaned on the railing, breathing deeply, when I heard footsteps behind me. "You look beautiful tonight," Ethan said, softly joining me. I turned, startled by the honesty in his tone. "Thank you. It's a lovely evening." He stared out at the city lights. "Do you remember when we were kids, you'd sneak me out onto your mom's fire escape to watch the street below? We used to plan our futures." I smiled faintly. "You wanted to build skyscrapers. I wanted a little inn with a garden." "Life didn't go as we planned," he murmured. "No," I agreed. "But in some ways, it turned out better." Silence stretched between us, comfortable for the first time in months. Then he sighed heavily. "I keep thinking about what you said about being true to yourself, and I don't know if I am." I glanced at him, my heart tightening. "Cold feet are normal before a wedding. This feels like more than cold feet," he confessed. "The way she and her mother treated you, It opened my eyes. And it's not just you. I've seen how she talks to servers, how she sneers at my friends, how every conversation is about climbing higher. I thought I could handle it, that love was enough. But now you wonder if you're marrying a future you don't even want. I finished for him. He nodded, his shoulders sagging. And with the wedding so close, everything paid for, guests flying in, I feel trapped. Trapped is no way to start a marriage, I said gently. Better a cancelled wedding than a lifetime of regrets. Before he could answer, Lauren's voice sliced through the night. There you are. She stood in the doorway, her smile brittle, her eyes flashing. Everyone's asking where you've gone. Ethan straightened his mask, sliding back into place. Just getting some air with Marissa. Lauren's gaze darted between us, suspicion hardening her features. Don't be long. The Harringtons are leaving, and they came all the way from London. When she retreated inside, Ethan exhaled. See what I mean? Always managing. Always watching. I touched his arm, my voice steady. Whatever you decide, Ethan, make sure it's your choice, not hers, not Margaret's. Yours. He looked at me with something like gratitude, then nodded slowly. Thank you. I'll think about it. As he returned inside, I lingered on the terrace, the breeze tugging at my hair. For the first time, I sensed the foundation of their fairy tale wedding cracking. Ethan's doubt wasn't cold feet, it was a man realizing the trap he'd walked into. And deep down I knew the decision he made in the next 48 hours would change everything for all of us. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, Charleston bathed in golden light that made the city look almost unreal. From my suite at the Cole Grand, I could see the gardens below transformed overnight into a floral wonderland. White roses and orchids arched over the ceremony, space silk ribbons fluttered in the breeze, and chandeliers sparkled beneath the outdoor tent. Guests had begun to arrive already, their laughter floating through the open windows. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. Staff moved briskly through the halls, whispering about the confrontation that had rocked the family earlier in the week. They looked at me with a new kind of respect, as if my refusal to be erased had given them permission to believe in their own worth too. Anthony met me outside the ballroom with a clipboard. Everything's on schedule, he said. But you should know, Margaret is prowling. She's been snapping at everyone since dawn. I gave a wry smile. Let her snap. Today isn't about her. Yet the moment I stepped into the bridal suite, I realized Margaret had every intention of making it about her. She and Lauren stood together in front of the mirror, their reflections eerily alike, Pearl's perfect posture and that same practiced smile that never touched the eyes. Lauren's gown shimmered with beads that must have cost more than most cars, her veil cascading to the floor. She looked like a queen prepared for coronation. When she noticed me, her smile faltered. You're here, she said, as though she hadn't expected it despite the signed agreements and apologies. I am, I replied, keeping my voice even. I told you I wouldn't miss it. Margaret's lips tightened. Just remember your place, Marissa. This is Lauren's day, not yours. I almost laughed. My place. They'd been trying to define it for me my entire life, caretaker, provider, servant, invisible sister. Not anymore. My place, I said calmly, is wherever I choose to stand. Before she could reply, Ethan's sister rushed in with a bouquet of roses. It's time, she chirped, her eyes darting nervously between us. The bridal party began to assemble, lining up in a flurry of satin and lace. Guests rose as the music swelled, the string quartet's notes carrying across the garden. I took my seat in the front row where I belonged, my mother on one side, my father on the other. For once, neither tried to diminish me. They both sat stiff and silent, as if finally realizing that their years of favoritism had led us here. Ethan stood at the altar, handsome in his tuxedo, but I saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. As Lauren appeared at the end of the aisle, escorted by Charles, gasps rippled through the crowd. She was stunning, radiant, even her smile wide as she soaked in the attention. But when I looked at Ethan, I saw something else: hesitation. The ceremony began, the minister's voice steady as he spoke of love, unity, and trust. Lauren beamed, glancing at the guests drinking in their admiration. Margaret dabbed her eyes delicately with a silk handkerchief. I sat still, watching Ethan more than I listened to the words. When the minister reached the pivotal line, "If anyone can show just cause why this couple should not be joined in matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace," a hush fell over the garden. It was the kind of silence that hums with tension, every guest holding their breath. And then Ethan looked at me. Not at his bride, not at his parents, not at the crowd. At me. Something shifted in his eyes, like a curtain being drawn back. He straightened his voice, breaking the silence. "I have something to say." Gasps rippled through the guests. Lauren's smile froze, her bouquet trembling in her hands. Margaret's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with horror. The minister faltered. "Mr. Whitmore." Ethan's voice was steady, now strong. "I can't do this. Not like this. Not when it means betraying the values I was raised with. Not when I nearly lost the person who has always been there for me." A murmur spread through the crowd. Lauren's face contorted disbelief, giving way to fury. "Ethan," she hissed. "What are you doing?" "I'm ending this," he said firmly. "Lauren, you're beautiful, you're accomplished, but this marriage would be a lie. I've been trying to mold myself into someone I'm not, to fit into your world, to please your family. And in the process, I nearly destroyed the bond I had with my sister, the person who taught me what real loyalty looks like." His words cut through the garden like a blade. Margaret gasped, clutching her pearls. Charles shut his eyes as if bracing for impact. Lauren's hands shook so violently, the bouquet nearly slipped from her grasp. "This wedding is cancelled," Ethan announced to the stunned guests. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but I can't stand here and make promises I know I can't keep." Chaos erupted. Some guests whispered furiously, others gasped aloud. A few, surprisingly, began to clap. Lauren let out a strangled cry and turned on me, her eyes blazing. "This is your fault," she shrieked. "You poisoned him against me." I rose, slowly meeting her gaze without flinching. "No, Lauren. You did that yourself." Margaret lunged forward, grabbing her daughter's arm, hissing under her breath, "Get control of yourself." But it was too late. The fairy tale had shattered. The perfect society wedding had collapsed in front of 200 witnesses. Ethan left the altar and walked straight to me. The crowd parted, murmuring as he took my hand. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "Thank you, Marissa, for reminding me who I am." I squeezed his hand. "Better now than years from now." He nodded, relief flooding his features. "Exactly." Behind us, Lauren crumpled into a chair, sobbing hysterically. Margaret barked orders to her attorney. Charles simply stared at the ground, shoulders sagging. The guests whispered louder, phones already buzzing as they shared the scandal in real time. I walked Ethan away from the chaos, my arm linked with his, guiding him back inside the Cole Grand. He leaned against the wall in my office, his composure finally cracking. "I can't believe I just did that," he whispered, half laughing, half crying. "Did you see their faces?" "I did," I said softly, handing him a glass of water. "It was the bravest thing I've ever seen you do." He drank deeply, then looked at me with raw gratitude. "I thought I was trapped forever. But when I looked at you, I remembered what real family feels like. Not transactions. Not appearances. Just love." My throat tightened, but I managed a smile. Then it was worth it. Out in the garden, the wreckage of the wedding continued. Guests filed out in clusters, buzzing with gossip. Florists dismantled the arch, waiters carried untouched champagne back inside. And in the bridal suite, I could only imagine Margaret's fury boiling over as Lauren's sobs echoed down the hall. For me, though, the storm had already passed. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had my brother back. The hours after the cancelled wedding felt like a surreal blur. Guests scattered from the Cole Grand, in clusters, their voices echoing through the marble lobby as they speculated about what they had just witnessed. Some looked scandalized, others exhilarated, a few even sympathetic. but all of them knew they had been part of a story that would be whispered across Charleston's social circles for months, maybe years. Upstairs in my office, Ethan sat, slumped on the leather sofa, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his tie loosened, his face pale. I brought him a glass of bourbon, and he took it gratefully, staring into the amber liquid like it might hold the answers. "I feel like I've detonated a bomb," he murmured. "In a way you did," I said gently, settling into the chair across from him. "But bombs clear space too. They make room for rebuilding." He let out a hollow laugh. "Rebuilding what? My reputation, my career, my life. Start with yourself," I said. "Everything else will follow." Before he could respond, my assistant knocked on the door. "Miss Cole," she whispered urgently, "Margaret Blake is in the lobby. She's demanding to see you." I stiffened. Ethan set down his glass, his jaw tightening. "Don't let her up," he said quickly. But I shook my head. "No, Ethan. Let's face this. Together." Moments later, Margaret stormed into my office, her pearl necklace glinting under the lights, her eyes sharp enough to cut glass. Behind her trailed Charles, looking weary, and Lauren, still in her ruined gown, mascara streaked down her cheeks. "How dare you?" Margaret hissed before the door even closed. "You orchestrated this. You poisoned my son against my daughter." I stood calmly, refusing to be rattled. "Your son made his own decision, Mrs. Blake. I only reminded him of who he is." Lauren's sobs rose. "You've humiliated me. In front of everyone. Do you know what people will say? That I wasn't enough for him, that I was rejected. I'll never live this down." Ethan finally spoke, his voice firmer than I'd heard in months. "No one rejected you, Lauren. I rejected the idea of living a lie. We would have been miserable, both of us." Margaret rounded on him. "You've ruined your future, Ethan. Do you understand the doors this marriage would have opened, the alliances, the power?" "I don't need doors that demand I shut out my sister," he said coldly. "If that's the price of your so-called alliances, they're not worth it." For once, Charles stepped forward, his voice weary but steady. "Margaret, stop. He's right. We've spent too long chasing appearances. Maybe it's time we listened." His wife shot him a look of pure venom, but he didn't back down. For a moment, the room hung in silence, the air thick with decades of power struggles and family fractures. Finally, Margaret spat out, "This isn't over. You may think you've won, but society has a long memory. You'll see what you've done when no respectable family welcomes you, when every deal falls through. You'll regret this." Then she swept out of the office, dragging Lauren with her. Charles gave us a tired nod before following them. When the door closed, Ethan collapsed back onto the sofa. "Do you think she's right? That I've ruined everything?" I sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No, you've saved yourself. There's a difference. It's hard now, but one day you'll look back and see this as the moment you reclaimed your life." He exhaled slowly, the weight of years pressing out of him. "I hope you're right." In the days that followed, the fallout hit like aftershocks from an earthquake. The society pages buzzed with headlines: "Charleston Harris left at the altar," "Scandal at the Cole Grand," "Whitmore," "Cole feud boils over." Photographers camped outside the hotel, hoping to catch a glimpse of Ethan or Lauren. Reporters left voicemails begging for statements, but not all the attention was negative. My inbox filled with messages from business leaders who quietly commended my stance. One wrote, "You showed strength and integrity in the face of manipulation. The Cole brand has only gained respect." Another offered a collaboration, saying he wanted to work with someone who valued honesty over appearances. Ethan, meanwhile, faced harsher realities. Margaret's friends withdrew invitations overnight. A partnership deal at his construction firm was abruptly postponed. His phone stopped buzzing with country club texts. But through it all, he seemed lighter, freer, as though the shackles of expectation had finally broken. One evening, a week after the wedding that never was, he showed up at my apartment carrying takeout from our favorite seafood shack. "I thought we should start a new tradition," he said with a small smile. "Something real. Just us. We sat cross-legged on my floor eating shrimp out of paper boxes, laughing for the first time in months. "Do you remember when we were kids?" Ethan said, between bites, "and we swore we'd never let anyone come between us?" "I remember," I said softly. "I broke that promise," he admitted. "And then you kept it," I replied. "When it mattered most." He fell silent, emotion flickering in his eyes. "I don't know what comes next, Marissa, but I know I'd rather face it broke and alone than rich and chained." "You won't be alone," I reminded him. "You've got me, always." 2 weeks later, a surprising development arrived. A letter hand-delivered from Howard Blake himself. Unlike his wife, he had been calm during the confrontation, almost pragmatic. His note was short but startling, "Miss Cole. I want to apologize personally for my family's conduct. It was beneath us, and I respect how you handled the situation. If you're willing, I'd like to discuss a potential business collaboration. Integrity like yours is rare, and I believe we can create something valuable together." It ended with his personal number. When I showed Ethan, his eyebrows shot up. "Do you trust him?" "I trust that he values results," I said thoughtfully. "And he's smart enough to recognize when someone has strength his wife lacks. Maybe this is a chance to turn chaos into opportunity." Ethan chuckled. "Only you would think of making a scandal into a business deal." "Not just a business deal," I corrected. "A lesson. About respect, boundaries, and what we stand for." That night I lay awake, replaying the whirlwind of the past weeks, the overheard call, the ultimatum, the confrontation, the broken wedding. It had been painful, exhausting, even humiliating at moments, but it had also revealed truths I could no longer ignore. That self-worth isn't defined by who invites you to their table, but by whether you dare to build your own. And as I drifted to sleep, I knew this was only the beginning. The battle with Margaret and Lauren wasn't over, but neither was the story of who Ethan and I could become: stronger, freer, and finally unashamed of who we truly were. The morning of what should have been Lauren's perfect day dawned bright and cloudless, the kind of June Saturday brides dream about. The gardens of the Cole Grand were already humming with activity: florists adjusting arrangements, musicians tuning their instruments, servers polishing glassware until it gleamed. From the outside, everything looked flawless. But behind the gilded doors, a storm was brewing. I stood at the back of the ballroom watching staff put finishing touches on the champagne fountain. My chest tightened. This was my venue, my creation, my pride. And yet for weeks, my own name had been scratched off every plan, as if I were nothing more than hired help. Not today. Guests began to arrive in waves. Limousines pulled up, spilling out Charleston's elite in silk gowns and tailored suits. Cameras flashed, whispers spread, and already the gossip had begun. Will she show her face? Will Ethan go through with it? I took my seat in the front row, dressed in deep emerald satin, a color that exuded calm but carried steel underneath. When Lauren's eyes met mine across the aisle, her smile faltered. Margaret, stiff beside her, gripped her clutch so tightly her knuckles went white. I inclined my head slightly, the smallest acknowledgement, but enough to remind them I wasn't invisible. The ceremony began. Ethan walked to the altar, looking polished but tense, his jaw set, his hands clasped. The minister's voice carried through the air, but all I could hear was the thudding of my own heartbeat. When the doors opened and Lauren entered on her father's arm, the room collectively gasped. She was stunning in her custom gown, dripping pearls, veil trailing like a river of white silk. She looked like a princess about to claim her kingdom. Except the kingdom wasn't hers. Not if Ethan had the courage to claim himself. The vows unfolded. Lauren recited hers in a voice full of practiced sweetness, eyes darting occasionally toward the guests, as if she were aware every move was being scrutinized. Ethan followed, his voice strong at first, but then wavering, as the minister's next words cut the air. If anyone here can show just cause why this couple should not lawfully be joined in matrimony, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace. The silence stretched. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Somewhere a baby cried. Lauren's chin lifted higher, daring anyone to object. And then Ethan's voice broke the stillness. "I have something to say." A ripple went through the crowd. My stomach dropped. Lauren froze beside him, bouquet trembling in her hands. Margaret gasped audibly while Charles lowered his head into his palms. "I can't do this," Ethan continued, his voice clear and steady now. "Not like this. Not when I've been pretending to be someone I'm not. Not when I've nearly destroyed the only family bond that ever truly mattered to me." Every head turned toward me. My throat constricted, but I held his gaze. He looked at me. Not at Lauren, not at the crowd, but at me with the quiet conviction of a man who had finally remembered himself. Lauren hissed through clenched teeth. "Ethan, don't you dare." But he did. He turned to her, speaking so everyone could hear. "You're beautiful, Lauren, and accomplished. But this isn't love. It's performance. It's status. It's a contract signed with the wrong intentions. And I refuse to walk into a marriage built on appearances while sacrificing the people who've stood by me my whole life." Gasps filled the hall. The minister stammered, unsure what to do. Margaret rose from her seat, face red with fury. "Ethan, you will regret this. Do you know what you're throwing away?" "Yes," he said, lifting his chin. "I'm throwing away a prison." The room erupted. Lauren's bouquet hit the floor with a dull thud as she shrieked. "You've humiliated me. In front of everyone? Do you know what this will do to me?" "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice softer now but resolute. "Truly. But I won't live a lie." He turned, walked down the aisle, and without hesitation reached for my hand. His grip was firm, unshakable, the same way it had been when we were children crossing busy streets together. The crowd parted in stunned silence as we walked out side by side, leaving behind a hall full of whispers and shattered illusions. In my office upstairs, Ethan finally exhaled, his shoulders sagging. "Did I just ruin everything?" he asked, half laughing, half trembling. "No," I said, squeezing his hand. "You just saved yourself, and you saved us." Tears welled in his eyes. "I almost lost you. I almost let them erase you, Marissa." "What kind of brother does that?" "The kind who forgets," I answered gently. "But you remembered when it mattered most." Before we could say more, the door burst open. Margaret stormed and dragging Lauren behind her. Eleanor-level rage radiated from her, sharp, cold, dangerous. "This is not the end," she spat. "We'll sue you, Ethan. For breach of promise, for damages, for every cent wasted today." Lauren sobbed dramatically into her mother's shoulder, though her eyes cut toward me with venom. "You did this," she snarled. "You wanted him for yourself, not as a bridegroom but as your shield. You made him choose." Ethan stepped forward, his voice like iron. "No one made me choose. I chose my dignity. I chose my sister. And if you can't understand that, then maybe it's time I stopped caring about your approval." Charles entered behind them, his face lined with exhaustion. "Enough," he said firmly. "This circus has gone far enough. Let the boy go." Margaret whirled on him. "You're weak. You always have been. Or maybe I'm tired," he said quietly. "Tired of watching you and Lauren destroy everything with your obsession for status." For once, Margaret had no retort. She pulled her daughter toward the door, seething. "You'll regret this, both of you." When the door slammed shut, silence filled the room. Ethan looked at me, his expression a mixture of relief and fear. "Do you think she means it, that they'll come after me legally?" "Let them try," I said evenly. "They don't have a case, and even if they did, the truth is on our side. You chose honesty. That's something no lawsuit can take away." Ethan sank onto the sofa, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what happens next. But for the first time in months, I feel free." "Then that's enough for today," I said softly. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out the rest." As the sun set over the city, casting golden light across the Cole Grand, I realized this day had given me more than vindication. It had given me back my brother, and that more than any revenge or victory was worth everything. The days after the broken wedding unfolded like the slow clearing of a storm. The Cole Grand was quiet again, its polished marble floors reflecting sunlight instead of whispers. Yet the echoes of what had happened, Ethan's refusal, Lauren's screams, Margaret's threats, still clung to the air like smoke after a fire. I spent the morning in my office sifting through emails. Dozens of messages poured in, some from journalists, fishing for sound bites, some from clients who wanted reassurance, and a surprising number from strangers. Women wrote to say my story gave them courage to set boundaries. Men confessed they'd been manipulated into loveless marriages and wished they'd walked away as Ethan had. For the first time in years, I felt my story and my pain might actually mean something to others. That afternoon, I met Ethan for brunch at a little cafe near the waterfront. He looked lighter, though the dark circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. "I thought everyone would hate me," he admitted, stirring his coffee. "But you know what? The guys at work actually shook my hand, said it took guts to walk away. One even said he wished he'd done the same years ago." I smiled. "Because you didn't just run, you stood up. People respect that even if they don't say it out loud." He leaned across the table, lowering his voice. "Lauren hasn't stopped calling. She wants a meeting. Claims she just needs closure." I raised an eyebrow. "And what do you want?" he sighed. "Part of me wants to hear her out, but the other part knows she won't apologize. She'll try to twist the story, make me doubt myself again." "Then don't go," I said firmly. "You've already given her too much power. Closure doesn't come from her. It comes from you deciding you don't need her anymore." His eyes softened. "You always were the strong one." "No," I corrected. "I just got tired of pretending weakness was love." Later that week, something unexpected happened. Howard Blake requested a meeting. Unlike his wife, he was calm, measured, even respectful. We met in a private dining room at one of his dealership's restaurants. He ordered bourbon. I chose iced tea. "I want to be clear," he began, leaning forward. "I don't condone how my wife or daughter treated you. It was cruel. But I admire how you handled yourself. Few people would have had the courage to confront them publicly." I regarded him carefully. "So what is it you're really here for?" His lips quirked in a faint smile. "Opportunity. You see, Margaret may love appearances, but I love results. Your hotel chain is thriving. Your catering arm has built a reputation for excellence. I think we could work together, events, travel partnerships, even joint ventures. Integrity like yours has value." I studied his face, looking for manipulation. But what I saw was a businessman who respected strength where his wife saw only threat. "If we work together," I said, "it will be on my terms. Respect fairness and transparency. No hidden strings." He nodded. "That's exactly why I came to you." When we parted ways, I felt a strange sense of vindication. Margaret and Lauren had tried to erase me, yet her own husband saw me as someone worth investing in. Karma had its own quiet poetry. Meanwhile, Ethan was rebuilding. He returned to work at his construction firm, throwing himself into projects with renewed focus. Some society doors had slammed shut, but others opened, real doors, honest ones. He even started reconnecting with old friends, people he'd pushed aside while trying to climb Margaret's ladder. One evening he came by my apartment carrying a bottle of wine and a sheepish grin. "Do you remember Sarah from the city planning office? The one who used to help me with permits?" I nodded cautiously. "She reached out after hearing what happened," he continued. "Said she admired me for standing up for myself. We had coffee, then dinner, and well..." He shrugged, but his eyes sparkled in a way I hadn't seen in months. I laughed. "So while one wedding crashed and burned, another possibility is blooming?" He chuckled. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." "But she sees me for who I am, not who I'm supposed to be. That feels new and good." I touched his hand. "That's all you need. Someone who values the real Ethan." Weeks later, I received another visitor, one I never expected. Lauren. She arrived at the hotel lobby unannounced, wearing simple jeans and a cardigan instead of couture. Her makeup was minimal, her posture tense. My assistant hesitated, but I agreed to see her. She sat across from me in my office, wringing her hands. "I came to apologize," she said quietly. "Not the kind of apology my mother would script, but a real one. I know I can't undo what I did, but I wanted you to hear me say I was wrong." I studied her wary. Wrong about what? Her eyes brimmed with tears. About everything. About treating you like staff instead of family. About trying to erase you while keeping your money. About thinking love was something you could buy with chandeliers and imported flowers. Her voice cracked. After Ethan left me, I was furious. I blamed him, I blamed you, I blamed everyone. But then, I jumped into another relationship, thinking it would fix the hole. It didn't. He treated me the same way I treated you, like a trophy. And when I overheard him talking about me the way you overheard me, it broke me. I finally understood. I sat back stunned. For once there was no smugness, no performance. Just a young woman stripped of illusions. "I don't expect forgiveness," Lauren whispered, "but I wanted to return this." She slid an envelope across the desk. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000. My breath caught. "Why now?" "Because it wasn't mine to keep," she said simply. "And because I need to start over clean?" I nodded slowly. "This doesn't erase what happened, but it matters. It shows you're trying." She swallowed hard. "Do you think Ethan will ever forgive me?" "That's for him to decide," I said gently. "But if you want any chance, don't try to spin the story. Just own it. That's the only way forward." She left quietly, and for the first time I didn't feel anger when I watched her go. Only a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, she could change. That night I met Ethan and Sarah for dinner. Over dessert I told him about Lauren's visit. His fork froze halfway to his mouth. "She gave the money back." "She did," I confirmed. He shook his head in disbelief. "I never thought I'd see that day." "People surprise you," I said. "Sometimes for worse, sometimes for better." Sarah smiled warmly, placing her hand over Ethan's. "What matters is who you are now. And I like the man sitting here with me." Ethan looked at her, then at me, gratitude softening his features. "I wouldn't be that man without you, Marissa. You reminded me of who I really am." I felt tears sting my eyes, but they were the good kind this time, the kind that came with healing. The wedding had ended in ashes, but from those ashes something truer was rising, family reclaimed, lessons learned, and futures built not on appearances, but on authenticity. And for the first time in years, I believed everything was exactly as it should be. 6 months after the day that changed everything, I sat at my desk in the Cole Grand, the morning light pouring across a stack of financial reports. Numbers told me the hotel chain was thriving. Elite catering was booked solid for the next year, and the deposit fund Lauren had returned had already been transformed into something greater. But the real story wasn't in the numbers. It was in the way my life had shifted quietly, profoundly towards something that finally felt like balance. We had created the True Love, True Values Grant, a program that gave couples with modest means access to venues and catering when their commitment reflected more than status. Our first recipients were a schoolteacher and a firefighter who had met during hurricane relief efforts. Watching them exchange vows in the garden of the Cole Grand, surrounded not by chandeliers, but by laughter and sincerity, reminded me why I built this business in the first place. As for Ethan, he was thriving too. He and Sarah had grown inseparable. Where Lauren once demanded he improve himself to fit into her circles, Sarah celebrated who he already was. She attended his job sites in dusty boots, joked with his crew, and cooked dinner with him after long shifts. I could see in his eyes that this was no performance, no facade. It was real. One Sunday brunch at a cafe we'd both loved since college, Ethan leaned across the table and whispered, "I asked her to marry me." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Already he grinned sheepishly. Not a ballroom or 1,000 roses. Just me, her, and a park bench where we first sat and talked for hours. She said yes. Tears welled in my eyes as I reached for his hand. "Then, you've already won, Ethan. This time, it's love. The wedding, when it came, was nothing like the spectacle planned with Lauren. It was simple, heartfelt, held in the garden of our newest property, a place filled with jasmine and magnolia blossoms. Only close friends and family attended. Ethan asked me to stand beside him as his best woman. When I adjusted his tie that morning, he looked at me with a gratitude that words couldn't hold. "You saved me," he said quietly. "No," I corrected, brushing a speck from his lapel. "You saved yourself. I just refused to let you forget who you are." The ceremony was beautiful. When Ethan and Sarah exchanged vows, there were no cameras flashing, no society gossip, no staged grandeur, just truth. And as I watched them promise each other a life of honesty and respect, I realized something vital. The revenge I once thought I wanted had transformed into something deeper. Not just payback, but growth, healing, and the reclamation of dignity for both of us. A month later, I received a call that startled me. It was Howard Blake. He invited me to lunch at a quiet restaurant far from Charleston's society glare. I considered refusing, but curiosity won. He arrived without Margaret, dressed in a simple navy suit. He ordered a sandwich, not a lavish spread. After a few moments of small talk, he got to the point. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "Strange as it may sound, what happened forced my family to face truths we'd ignored for years. Margaret, but Lauren has been seeing a therapist. She's working. And she told me you spoke with her honestly, without cruelty." That mattered. I leaned back surprised. I never expected to hear that. "People change, Marissa," he said quietly. "Sometimes only after life knocks them flat. You gave her that knock even if you didn't intend to." When we parted, I realized the cycle was closing. My fight had never been about destroying Lauren or her family. It had been about reclaiming myself. And in doing so, I had forced them to confront their own reflections. On evenings when the hotel was quiet, I often sat in the ballroom alone, listening to the echo of my footsteps. The same space where Lauren had tried to erase me, where Ethan had reclaimed his voice, where society's eyes had burned on me, now felt different. It wasn't haunted, it was hallowed. Proof that integrity could withstand even the cruelest betrayals. One night, Ethan joined me, Sarah on his arm. "You know," he said, gazing up at the chandelier that Lauren once wanted torn down, "this place feels like redemption now." "Because it is," I replied. Sarah smiled softly. "And because you two turned a nightmare into something stronger. Most families don't come back from this." I thought about her words long after they left. She was right. We hadn't just survived, we'd transformed. Looking back, I understood the deeper lesson. Success wasn't about how many hotels I owned or contracts I signed. It was about the boundaries I set, the dignity I defended, and the courage to walk away from those who treated me as less. By refusing to be excluded, I discovered that revenge doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes it means standing tall until the tables turn by themselves. If you've listened to my story this far, maybe you faced something similar, being overlooked, excluded, manipulated by people who claim to love you. Maybe you felt that ache of betrayal from family, or the sting of realizing money and effort were taken, but your presence wasn't valued. I want you to know this: you are not defined by the invitations you don't receive, or the love withheld by those too blind to see your worth. You are defined by the way you stand back up, by the boundaries you build, by the dignity you refuse to surrender. For me, it started with overhearing a cruel phone call and ended with rebuilding my bond with the only brother I'll ever have. For you, it might look different, but the truth is the same. You hold the power to decide what treatment you'll accept. So now, I'll leave you with this question. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself when someone tried to erase your worth? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear it. And if this journey touched you, if you felt the rise and fall of betrayal and redemption with me, then please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about rediscovering your own strength. Because in the end, respect isn't something given, it's something claimed. And once you claim it, no one, not even family, can take it away.